Hello and welcome to this episode of How to Be a Great GM. Well, in today's episode, by request, we're looking at how to convert fantasy modules and adventures and campaigns into science fiction or science fantasy or space opera or sci-fi or modern or future, whatever you want to call it. We're looking at how to take your favorite fantasy settings and move them across into a science fiction setting. Now this is relatively straightforward and fairly easy, and so you should be able to do it almost on the fly. This doesn't take a huge amount of preparation or anticipation. It really is just about knowing the two different settings and then being able to talk them and walk them across. Now, I'm not talking mathematical numbers here. I'm not talking how to convert armor class into EAC and all that kind of wonderful stuff, although it is a fairly simple translation. There are many others who will help you with that. I am talking, of course, about how to move your story and your setting across to make it feel as if it's a science fiction setting and not just that hobbits have become Ugnaughts and Mordor is now Coruscant and that sort of thing. We're looking at it from a slightly more interesting perspective than that. So, to begin with, where do we start? Well, we look at the translation of the easy stuff. The goal. A goal within a fantasy setting or within a science fiction setting is usually the same. Take the One Ring to the mountain and destroy it. Fly an armada towards the space station and destroy it. Both require a long journey. There's anticipation of things going wrong. There's all sorts of things that need to be found out, and one can simply translate that across. So, how do we do that? Well, if we look at the ring, the one true ring, it cannot be destroyed by any means. Well, translating that into a science fiction setting, this is what we call in script writing our MacGuffin. It is the thing that motivates. So the journey is still going to be the same, but now instead of transferring through the Shire and Rivendell and the mountains of, the Misty Mountains, I should say, and Mirkwood and such forth and so on, we're now transversing through things like space nebula, dense black voids where there is nothing out there, or is there? So one can do the easy stuff rather simply. Instead of the Misty Mountains, we now have the dense space nebula of Mysterious, or however you want to do it. In that nebula, there are some strange things that lurk and hide away, and at the very heart of the nebula, where it is most densest, there is this terrific space creature which survives off of the minerals within the nebula that will attack the spaceship as it passes through, aka a Balrog. And we can have lots of little swarmy people who live on the little planets that are within the nebula that they come across in pockets, maybe hive ships or something along the like, to simulate the goblins. As of course we head into Mirkwood, which was very dark and very dense and filled with strange things, well, perhaps we enter into void space where there is no stars visible. The space is thick and dark and antimatter abounds everywhere. And of course there are these strange species that lives within this territory that doesn't like intruders, and that will do everything in their power to subvert them, direct them elsewhere, and of course there are creatures within it that will cause memory loss and that sort of thing, so that the party just moves beyond their space faster, or they try and consume them. Again, it's up to you on how to translate. So the goal remains the same. Destroy this data chip before the Empire can get hold of it. And we can't destroy it under normal means because it's thoroughly encrypted, or this holocron which contains Sith teachings must be destroyed in a very specific way, otherwise it will bring about the end of the galaxy. It's about trying to simply move across. So we're looking at the easy things. Names are easy to change, as you've been seeing. So you change the names. The goal remains the same, but the MacGuffin changes. You change the names of things. Mirkwood becomes Dark Space, or Mirk Space if you really want to change it so literally that your players instantly get what you've done. You change the locations, as you've seen me doing now. We simply migrate from one to the other as normal as possible, so that it makes sense without losing too much. Now, something that becomes important is that we have now got a map which shows the Shire and Mirkwood, and I'm sticking to the Lord of the Rings example because I think it works quite nicely for this particular video, is you've got the Shire and then you've got Rivendell and then etc, etc. To translate that becomes even easier. Where you have villages, you now have planets or space stations. Where you have mountains, you now have asteroid fields. It's about trying to figure out how to translate across and then being consistent with it. Once you've done that, it's as simple as going, well, every single mountain range is now a destroyed planet, an asteroid field, a ship graveyard filled with wrecks and ruins. You can really go to town using these existing maps, and again you take it into Photoshop or you put a piece of paper over the existing map and you can trace roughly over the areas. Now if you look at this map behind me, it is out of focus purposefully so that yours truly remains in focus, but if you look at this map correlates very, very closely with the map of Braxia, my fantasy setting. This is my science fiction setting. All of those little planets that you can see, particularly in the blue space, those are cities that our fantasy characters would travel to via horse or griffin. These are now planets which our heroes will now travel to via spaceship or teleportation. And all of the linking lines in between are space lanes which allow them to move slightly faster. And we've got all of this big black space, oops, that way. We've got all of these black spaces which indicate empty space or voids and things. And then we move further up and into the rest of the galaxy with a light chance of rain later on. So be careful of that one. Well, actually, not rain, asteroid showers, perhaps, or maybe an electromagnetic pulse from a local star. We want to translate into science fiction as much as possible. Now, the important thing to bear in mind, though, is that if this area of space, for example, represents the Shire, the blue territory represents the Shire, then we've got Mirkwood moving on, and then so on until we get all the way to Mordor, which is now hidden behind me. If this is the space territory, and it represents the Shires, the planets within it are where we start to now step slightly away from fantasy. But, and this is why it's so useful to do these exercises, I feel, is that we know that each and every single one of these planets needs to be expressed in a different way. Now, frequently in science fiction, and it is a failing, but it is something that we have to do for shorthand, really, frequently we are coming across planets in science fiction worlds that are all one type of planet. So when we come across a Class M planet, to use Star Trek's nomenclature, when we come across this planet, it's a desert planet, or it's a water planet, or it's an ice planet. Now yes, ice planets exist, water planets exist, but when we come across those amazing world life-giving planets, they should be as diverse as our own Earth. Deserts, rainforests, glaciers, tundra, open savannas, the veldt, as we call it here in South Africa. Veldt, although it's spelled with a V, yes, it makes sense. If we have a planet that is the same everywhere, that becomes awfully dull. Even Mars has got ice caps at the tops and the bottom. It's got great big open plains. It's got rocky mountains. It's got a lot of diversity in it. And that is something that we have to do. And that is something that we haven't necessarily done in our fantasy setting. And that too is a failing. If I were to take you to the three major cities within South Africa, you've got Johannesburg, which is where I'm based, which is this mega sprawling mass of humanity, where even within the city we've got slum areas, we've got high-class areas, and then everything in between. But the feeling of the city is a dry but very green city. It's the largest man-made forest in the world. Literally, there's more trees here than there are people. So it's this strange dichotomy of this foreboding city with a massive crime rate and trees everywhere. If I were to take you to the coastal city down on the east coast, there it's a very different experience. The architecture is similar, the layout is similar, but there, instead of forest, we've got jungles that are hot and humid. And the ocean doesn't bring relief in terms of cold breezes, it just brings more humidity. So there's an oppressive nature to it. And when wind blows, it usually picks up beach sand and sprays it all over the inhabitants, and then covers them in humidity so it becomes more like this sort of brown, muddy substance. It's a lovely city, you should go and visit it regularly. If I were then to take you to the East Coast and to our other city of Cape Town, the tourist centre of South Africa, you would encounter a medieval European type layout where we've got cobbled streets and little houses that sit on top of one another, all spread around this great big mountain known as Table Mountain, which doesn't very much look like a table. The four legs are very poorly carved and the top is not entirely flat. So I'd describe it more as perhaps an amateur Table Mountain, but anyway, that's beside the point. The idea is that that city is very different. There's very little humidity around. The composition of people are different. They only wake up at about 10 or 10:30 in the morning and don't do very much work. The people in the Durban city all are up at 5 in the morning because they're all surfing on the warm ocean currents, and those of us in Johannesburg are up at 5 in the morning because we're all working as hard as we can to help pay for the amount of money that the city costs in order to live in. 3 very different cities. In your fantasy map, do you have 3 cities that are within 250 miles of one another that are so diverse, that are so different, and that have such different flavors of people, of environments, of commerce, that sort of thing? If your fantasy maps have that, fantastic. And I'm not just talking about an elvish city being different from a dwarvish city being different from a human city. Dwarvish cities should be different from dwarvish cities. Elvish cities should be different from elvish cities. And human cities should be as diverse as ours are here on this planet, if you want to go in depth. That means that if we are translating our fantasy setting into a science fiction setting, the cities should be able to speak to the type of planet that we have. Whereas maybe the Durban planet is very humid, there's lots of jungle everywhere, the people are very much orientated around leisure and enjoyment, and there's beautiful vistas and that kind of thing. That might be the one planet. The next planet over is the Cape Townian one, which has got more ancient architecture. It's been settled for a long time, with interesting geographical features around half of the planet, and the other half is this desert-like scrubland. But it's got such a diverse nature of plants and things that a lot of it has been converted into a conservancy, as opposed to perhaps a capital planet right in the middle of the map, which is this dingy, grungy type of space for the commoners, but the upper levels are covered in vegetation and plantation that has been imported from other planets and creates this amazing difference between the class levels and between the financial levels. So it's about using what you've got and then improving it, and it works both ways in this case. Where with planets we have to think more carefully about the type of planet, the type of star it's orbiting around, and those kind of factors if you want to go that far. With fantasy we tend to be a little bit lazy when it comes to cities, and I know I can say it with absolute impunity because I myself have human cities that are very, very similar. It's only recently that I've started to really focus on trying to create trying to create cities that are unique to the specific culture in that specific space, regardless of whether it's humans or dwarves or a mixture thereof. So we have to look at how we come up with our planets and how we make them as different from one another as possible, and sometimes they can be very, very similar, but with something that has changed or something that is slightly different. Now, a phrase that I've written down here is that your magic needs more RAM. This literally translates into, if you're doing a science fiction setting such as Star Trek, or even Star Wars for that matter, or D20 Future, or Cyberpunk, or pick 20 different systems that are based in the future, how do you translate magic into science fiction? Well, Arthur C. Clarke said it best when he said something along the lines that once technology gets to a point where those that use it don't understand how it works, it might as well be magic. And I have butchered that quote to the nth degree, but the point is the same. If I were to ask you how electricity got from a nuclear power station to this light over here, you'd be wrong in saying that it did, because we only have one nuclear power station that's down south far away from the city. But aside from that little piece of useless information, the idea is that we as humans don't understand a lot of the technology that's going on around us. The cell phone that I use to record these videos on, for example, I understand how light gets converted into binary, but don't ask me how it all gets stored onto a solid-state memory drive and those kind of things. That blows my mind. Is it magic? Well, we trust that it isn't. We trust that it's electronics and physics, but it might as well be. So in other words, if you have a magical device, say for example the ring, which allows you to control or disappear completely, well perhaps then that's a cloaking field that is generated by this device that allows the user to be wrapped around in this cloaking field that prevents others from detecting it. But we also want that cloaking field to be as dangerous as the ring was when the bearer was wearing it. The bearer had long life, had a certain dementia that sort of kicked in, an obsessive, compulsive desire to possess this ring, as well as it allowed the enemy to see them. So this device, which allows you to cloak yourself, it also emits a certain type of theta radiation. And this theta radiation slowly affects the mind of the user, driving them completely mad as they obsess over this device. That theta radiation also emits a low-level signal, which is detectable from across the galaxy by those that are knowing what to look for. And in this case, that would then be the enemy, the race of Orkesh, which are in spaceships that are flying all over the galaxy searching for them. Or you could call them the, whatever your device is called, wraiths if you really want to, or seekers, or you get the idea. So, translating magic into technology is generally a case of translating a metaphysical thing into a mechanical device and then trying to work out using fancy terms like a polaron reversal flux capacitor and using that instead of, say, oh, I don't know, fireball, for example. Our expectations also need to change, don't they? So in space, in science fiction, generally speaking, we're expecting space battles, we're expecting traveling over the void. In fantasy, we're expecting traveling through forests and rivers and lakes and chasms, and we're expecting to be attacked by creatures on horseback or flying or just generally in the area. So we need to change up how we look at our encounters. Our encounters shift insofar as now they're in space, and now we have a collective group who are fighting against spaceships and things, unless they're on a planet, of course, in which case, if they're on a planet, it's very similar to how your fantasy setting would play out. You have your encounters, and they just walk up to one another and they engage. The trick, though, is that things change when you have vast technology. Today, for example, if a gunshot sounds off in your neighborhood, within minutes there's a security force, hopefully if you're in the right country, that has responded to that gunshot because observers have alerted. And the more advanced technology we get, the more we move towards our science fiction future, the more observation becomes easier and easier, and the more instant responses can be. Now, if we had AI drones that could apprehend or dart people or immobilize them with some kind of EM pulse, aka the sleep spell, if we had those kind of things, and the moment something was fired off, a remote camera that's watching, and they're all over the place already, a remote camera signals these drones that arrive at the speed of near light, or they move exceptionally fast. So our surveillance becomes a trick. Now, in fantasy, you don't necessarily have that. Yes, you've got the wizard spell alarm in certain systems, or you've got some kind of detection power in others. All of that is in play, but it's fairly uncommon. A thief breaking into a commoner's house isn't about to set off 100 burglar alarms. Now, that is something that you need to take cognizance of. So when I say we need to change the adventures up, it's about looking at how do we now incorporate this incredibly interlinked society, this incredibly observed society, and an incredibly policed society with that. Now, obviously, if you're playing in an apocalyptic kind of sci-fi, those kind of questions, to a degree, fall away. We don't have necessarily as much advanced technology as we do. In Star Trek, if you're on a starship and you fire a phaser, alarms go off everywhere. So your players theoretically need to know about those kind of things. But again, it's your setting. So your players don't necessarily know what is and what is not available to them. Again, this is something that you can now mitigate if you have the players with an AI, with a droid, with a device that sits on their arm that communicates with the ship. The ship or your guide, whomever it is, and it's a guide to your universe, can say, I would recommend against that course of action. That will trip the alarm. The ability to disable that alarm is at that terminal over there. So you can slowly introduce your science fiction world to your players, because remember, science fiction, the challenge is that what we have today, almost instantaneous communication, the ability to travel around the planet fairly quickly, all those kind of things we already have. So to dumb it down in your science fiction universe is very difficult, and we've seen that with the latest Star Trek Discovery. It's set in a period that we're all very familiar with, but that series was shot in the 60s. Now Discovery is shot in the teens of the 21st century, and all of the tech has had to be upgraded so that it's ahead of the curve in terms of what we already have, which is very difficult. So it's something that you need to think about, is that when you are translating from fantasy into science fiction, that you are in actual fact trying to push the boundaries of technology so that they seem magical and that they can do things that we can't do today. Anyway, I hope this rather lengthy video on how to convert your favorite fantasy novel modules and adventures into a science fiction space has been helpful, and it's really not that difficult, and there's a lot of reward to playing in science fiction just as much as there is in fantasy, and sometimes it's about finishing off a fantasy campaign and then switching over to a science fiction campaign for a change of pace, and all sorts of other wonderful things that come with it. Or, of course, switching back the other way around. You can, of course, go from science fiction to fantasy just as easily. Until next time, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and if you're not aware of it, Bacon Battalion, our other channel, is alive and kicking with a new series, RPG series entitled The Adventures of the Windswift, which sees a crew of operatives travelling around the world of Braxia in a fantasy setting, trying to prevent dragons from returning and reclaiming their pristine planet of Braxia. At the end of each of those episodes, we also do an unpacking with myself and the players, where we look at the adventure from a player perspective and we see and discuss things that did work, things that didn't work, as well as what the GM was hoping to have happen and what didn't happen. It is rather informative, if I do say so myself. I'm certainly learning things from my players as we walk through these rather interesting adventures. Until next time, happy gaming.